Let me start with a parable. Have you heard the story of two stores that kept buying food from each other? One store buys food from the other, and the other store does the same, creating a cycle of transactions. They celebrate their massive sales, then they realize they're left with just a penny. Doesn't that seem foolish? But do you know what's even more foolish? It's modern nations. Let's tweak the story a bit. Imagine two companies endlessly buying a low marginal cost product like software from each other. In this case, no social welfare is created, but GDP diverges to infinity. Isn't it strange? If the economy isn't improving, why would GDP skyrocket? 'Cause GDP and economic prosperity is not same thing. You might argue that this is just a theoretical example and doesn't happen in reality, and GDP work well in real world. Fair enough. But the key point is this: GDP growth does not necessarily mean economic growth, and economic growth does not always lead to GDP growth. Let me explain why GDP is a useless concept. First, what is GDP? GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given period. Intermediate goods and products made abroad by domestic companies are excluded. Simple, right? But this definition has little problems. If the value of money halves, does that mean GDP has doubled? In practice, GDP calculations adjust for inflation to remove its effects. So far, so good. But what's wrong with GDP? The biggest issue with GDP is the very idea of summing up the sales of final products. The economy is not something that can be measured simply by price times quantity. The growth in total sales does not correspond to economic growth. The idea that GDP corresponds to economic prosperity is based on a naive and blind belief that the price of a product matches its value and that a society that spends more money is more advanced. Let's take an example. In the case of natural disasters, accidents, or wars, the economy actually worsens, but GDP is likely to increase. GDP is simply the product of price and quantity. People spend more money, GDP will increase. But that doesn't necessarily mean life get better. What about monopolies? Monopolies can decide production at the point where profit is maximized. This means a decrease in consumer surplus and market failure, but the sales of final products are likely to increase. GDP could increase even when the market fails and the economy regresses. Moreover, GDP fails even in measuring total production. For example, apples cost $2 per 1 kilogram in Italy and $7 in Korea. Are Korean apples really 3 times more valuable? According to GDP, they are. Both countries produce the same quantity of apples. Korea's GDP contribution from apples will be 3 times higher. But this isn't because Korean apples are 3 times better or because Koreans love apples 3 times more. It's because Korea's agricultural sector is heavily protected by tariffs and regulations. The high price of Korean apples is a result of market distortion, not superior value. And let's think hypothetical country where each person can spend only $100 per month. If everyone buys only domestically produced goods, total consumption expenditure would equal to population multiplied by 100 per month. This remains true regardless of the types or quantities of goods purchased. In other words, no matter what goods are purchased, the total consumption amount remains the same, irrespective of the quality, variety, or quantity of the products. Of course, modern economies are far more complex than this, but ultimately the amount of money available for consumption is limited, and consumption depends on how that limited money is allocated. However, does the fact that the total consumption amount is the same necessarily imply the same level of production? No. Cause GDP measures price rather than value, which makes it difficult to determine exactly how much value in production has been generated. But you could argue that I didn't account for inflation rate adjustment. You're right. However, inflation rate adjustment only reflects changes in prices. If the quality of goods changes, consumer preferences shift, or consumption patterns change, the inflation rate may not accurately capture these dynamics. Additionally, new goods and services are often poorly reflected in inflation measures. Since the inflation rate measures the difference between this year and the next, if the initial measurement is flawed, the entire calculation can be inaccurate. GDP also ignores all production that doesn't involve monetary transactions. For instance, if people improve their cooking skills and start making meals at home instead of eating out, GDP decreases, but people might actually be happier. Unpaid work, like household labor, isn't included in GDP. Finally, GDP can't tell us whether growth is sustainable. doesn't account for externalities like environmental destruction or other long-term costs. For example, consider a scenario where GDP grows alongside rising debt. While this might boost GDP in the short term, it could have severe long-term consequences for the economy. After COVID-19, many countries saw exponential debt growth alongside GDP growth. But is this sustainable? So why do we still use GDP despite its flaws? Partly out of habit and widespread belief in its validity, but also because GDP does capture some aspects of economic activity. However, GDP is merely an indicator of how much trading occurs within a country. It shouldn't be equated with the overall health of the economy. Then, how should we measure the economy? First, what is economic growth? Is it an increase in productivity? An improvement in quality of life? A rise in overall societal happiness? Or is it GDP growth, unemployment rates, income inequality, or levels of education and healthcare? The important thing is that focusing on just one factor can easily lead to bias. We need to consider a variety of factors. We shouldn't become fixated on a single indicator.